Hello, students. I want to begin our discussion of Topic 4, Becoming a World Power. Much like Topics 1 and 2, Topics 3 and 4 also occur within the same time frame, and that's primarily the early 20th century with a little bit of overlap into the 1890s. Topic 3 focused on domestic policy, the progressive era, a more active federal government in the lives of its citizens. Topic 4 likewise focuses on a more active federal government, but in this case, in foreign policy, so a more active United States on the world stage. And we'll progress to the point where we see the United States joining the ranks of what would be considered the great powers of the 20th century. Nations like Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and so forth. And we'll begin as the turning point in U.S. foreign policy, which is the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War is fueled by several causes. Amongst them is the yellow press, which is depicted here in this political cartoon. The two leading newspaper producers, editors at the time, Joseph Pulitzer on the left and William Randolph Hearst on the right. And the yellow press was kind of what we would call today clickbait or fake news. Their primary goal was to sell newspapers, and report the facts was sort of a secondary goal. So they would oftentimes print very sensational headlines that exaggerated reality or even made up stories whole cloth. The more sensational, the better, to get somebody to buy their newspaper. And in this political cartoon, they're depicted as actually building the war, building the Spanish-American War. And that's because they did contribute greatly to public opinion in favor of going to war. One of the most sensational things to report on at the time was the Cuban Revolution going on. Cuba was still a Spanish colony in 1898. And Spain had been an empire in decline for quite some time and had lost a large portion of its colonies, South America, Central America, Mexico, and so forth, but still retained some islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and Cuba was one of those islands. This latest rebellion against Spain was led by a guy named Jose Marti, and he was fighting a guerrilla-style warfare, which is not unusual for rebellions because you're oftentimes outgunned by the nation you're rebelling against. Think of the United States in the War for Independence and how we would do hit-and-run tactics and then disappear before the British could send their full force. Marti and the Cubans are doing the same thing. In response, the Spanish general Weyler will go out into the countryside and round up the Cubans living in the countryside to prevent them from supporting this rebellion with food and sheltering them. And oftentimes many of the rebels were in fact farmers in the countryside. Rounds them up, puts them into these concentration camps, and tens of thousands will die from disease and starvation. These stories are going to sell a lot of newspapers for people like Pulitzer and Hearst, and they will not only report these obviously terrible atrocities as is, but they will also exaggerate them in their headlines and sometimes make them up. Lurid tales of Spanish customs agents stopping American boats going to Cuba because there were many American businesses that owned property in Cuba, and they were very much concerned about this war, but there were also Americans who supported the Cuban rebels and may have been sending weapons to them. Well, when they would search these boats, the yellow press would report that they would strip search young American women so they could leer at their naked bodies. None of this actually occurred, but it sold newspapers, and it also whipped up American sentiment against Spain. The two events most often cited for sparking the U.S.'s declaration of war on Spain is the Delone letter and the destruction of the U.S. battleship Maine. The Delone letter was a letter that was intercepted by the Cuban rebels from the Spanish ambassador to the United States, written to the Spanish government. And in this letter, he describes our president, William McKinley, as a weak and stupid politician. This letter was then leaked to, I think it was Hearst, who published it. And, Americans were outraged that the Spanish would talk about our president this way. This was a time of heightened nationalism, what we would call jingoism. So nationalism is, the idea of putting your nation first, America first. And sometimes putting your nation above all else, putting your nation above yourself, sacrificing yourself for your nation, whatever else. And America was swept up in this wave of nationalism that was really sort of a worldwide thing, particularly in Europe. And it's this sort of heightened nationalism that leads to World War I and also World War II, because it contributes to the rise of fascism in countries like Italy and Germany. In the case of jingoism, if nationalism is going America, jingoism is saying America and then punching somebody in the face because you think they're not American, right? It's an aggressive, militaristic foreign policy based around nationalism. The destruction of the Maine, which is depicted here, the Maine was a U.S. battleship. It was in Havana Harbor, which is in Cuba, and it was there to protect American business interests, and the ship suddenly explodes. Now, an investigation from the Navy found that they may have run into a sea mine which caused it to explode. The press runs with this and claims that Spain and its treachery has blown up an American ship. You can see in their depiction here that American sailors are clearly shown being flung into the air as they die from this explosion. Several subsequent investigations after the war by the Navy indicate that actually what probably happened was there was a spontaneous combustion in the coal chamber of the coal dust floating in the air, and they had stored the gunpowder for the ship's big guns next to the coal chamber. So bad layout decision there. When it ignited the coal, it ignited the gunpowder, and the combination of the two created a massive explosion. But the reality of it isn't really what's important. The perception of it was that it was Spain, and we should go to war with them for it. In 1898, the United States declares war on Spain. President McKinley calls for 100,000 volunteers. 200,000 Americans sign up for the army. Such was the public sentiment, excitement about going to war. And this is also a time, with that jingoism and this 19th century idea of manliness that, we needed to prove ourselves on the field of battle and join the great powers of the world. However, Congress did insert the Teller Amendment in our Articles of War, which stated that we were not going to war to annex Cuba. We would not annex Cuba after the war. The idea was we would help them gain independence and then remove our troops. It does not include any other territories, and that is important. Commodore Dewey will bring the United States Navy into Manila Bay in the Philippines. Philippines, what am I talking about? Well, Philippines are on the other side of the world. They're islands off Southeast Asia. However, they were still also Spanish colonies, and they themselves did have a rebellion going on there against Spanish rule as well. Commodore Dewey absolutely destroys the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, and actually some historians think that Spain put up a fight just to, not go out like a punk, but had no intention of winning this, did not think they would. The U.S. had a much more up-to-date Navy. We were a nation on the rise. Spain's was very decrepit, as they were a nation in decline. And, navies were the arms race of the day. All the nations were competing with each other for the most advanced navies. And so the U.S. had a more advanced navy, crushed the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. Meanwhile, Filipino rebels under the command of Emilio Aguinaldo will capture the city of Manila, but the Spanish will not surrender to the rebels, to the Philippine rebels. They wait for the United States to send in troops, and then they surrender to the United States, effectively giving the U.S. control of the Philippines. Now, where the actual war was sort of focused, which is in the Caribbean, the United States will eventually get around to invading Cuba. However, we weren't really ready for it. American troops were going over in wool uniforms in the tropics. We didn't have enough boats to get all of our soldiers over there, so we had to wait a while. But we did have ships to blockade the Cuban ports and bottle up the Spanish fleet, which we will do. Eventually, we get enough boats around. We ship our soldiers over. 17,000 troops land near Santiago, Cuba. This painting here is a depiction of Teddy Roosevelt leading his fabled Rough Riders cavalry, which was a cavalry he raised himself. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned, so that he could raise a cavalry unit of cowboys and basically rich boys who played polo to go fight in this war. It's a little bit inaccurate to depict this the way they do. For one, not too many people actually had horses because they could only have enough boats to bring men over, and many of the horses were left back in Florida. And also, this does not depict the 9th and 10th Cavalry, two African American units fresh out of the Indian Wars and the Great Plains, who were also a big part of taking the highlands overlooking Santiago. With the highlands under American control, the Spanish fleet attempts to break the U.S. blockade and is utterly destroyed once again there. Spain surrenders Cuba after a couple of brief battles because I guess we were in the neighborhood. The United States also captures Puerto Rico. Spain surrenders, and we end this as what Secretary of War John Hay called Splendid Little War, which was a relatively short war with minimal American loss of life. Only 380 Americans died in battle. However, 2,500 to 3,000 of them died from tropical diseases. So as a result of this war, as promised, Cuba becomes an independent nation, but let's put an asterisk on that. When they draw up their constitution, the United States was involved for some reason, and we made them insert what's called the Platt Amendment into their constitution. And the Platt Amendment gave the U.S. control over Spain's internal, external, and economic affairs, which is basically everything, and a naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. In essence, the United States had sort of veto power over any decision made by the Cuban government, which meant that Cuba was, in name, an independent nation with its own country, or with its own government, but the United States really controlled Cuba. It was more of what we would call a protectorate. The U.S. gains control of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam, which is a tiny island between the United States and China out in the Pacific. Guam is very small. Almost everybody who lives in Guam is a member of the U.S. Navy for the base station there, but it provided a convenient recoaling station for our Navy and for merchant ships traveling and trading with East Asia, particularly China, which was still a very desirable goal for the United States. The decision to annex the Philippines, though, was a very controversial one because Puerto Rico was seen as being in our backyard. Guam was this, tiny island seen as a necessary fueling point. But if we annex the Philippines, that would really make us a nation with colonies. And many people, part of the Anti-Imperialist League in the United States, saw this as contrary to the ideals on which we were created in the Declaration of Independence. We were not a nation that was supposed to be taking colonies. We were a nation that stood for self-rule, that a people would control their own affairs. And for us to rule a colony on the other side of the world would definitely put us in league with Great Britain. The pro-expansionists like William McKinley made several arguments, one of them being that the Philippines was an important stepping stone to trade with China, or that if we did not annex them, some other nation like Germany might do it. So there's that competition between nations which is spurring this decision. But there's also a lot of, sense of superiority in the United States that, McKinley said we will civilize and uplift the Filipinos, indicating that we didn't think they were civilized people. This is controversial, but the decision is made by the Senate to annex the Philippines, and they make that decision by a margin of 1 vote. So a very close vote on that. The Filipinos, of course, were not included in that decision, were not happy about it. Emilio Aguinaldo and the Philippine rebels thought that the United States was coming in to help them become independent, not to make them an American colony instead of a Spanish colony. So we get a much longer war that occurs after this, the PhilippineAmerican War, and it is a much costlier war. 5,000 Americans will die in this war, and an estimated 200,000 Filipinos will die in this war. And the United States proceeds to do to the Filipinos what we complained about Spain doing to the Cubans, rounding them up, putting them in concentration camps. It is a nasty, brutal war But ultimately, the United States gains control of the Philippines and really kind of officially becomes an empire and among the world powers.